So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight with a look at the psychology of conspiracy belief, what influences every single one of us here to take them on board or to reject them. Please give a very, very warm Portsmouth Skeptics welcome to Mike Wood with Conspiracy Theories, Sense, Nonsense, and Everything in Between.
That warm welcome. Is this? No?
Oh, sorry,
oh. What about now? Oh, okay. You know what? I probably don't need this. I yell at my students every day anyway, so sometimes even in lectures. So, thank you all for coming. I'm excited to be here. I've not been down to Portsmouth very much, and I have to say you have a very lovely city here. And so, yeah, again, just thanks for coming out, and I'm here to tell you exactly what you came here to hear, which is obviously about me personally. I am, as you can tell, not from around here originally. I, in fact, come from Argentina, or, well, okay, maybe not Argentina. I actually come from Canada. The Great White North. The accent kind of gives it away. I came to the UK sort of because of conspiracy theories. That's what actually drew me here. Conspiracy theories are very near and dear to my heart. They're something that I kind of grew up on. The X-Files and the early internet were two of my big influences growing up. I watched the X-Files, and then I went on the internet, and there was no Google in those days. I guess I Alta Vista'd for alien abduction and things like that, and I saw like some of the interesting communities out there that were on the web. And over time, I sort of got, I took the X-Files, I guess, more seriously at the start than I did at the end, and at the end I was sort of skeptical of a lot of this stuff. But I saw from my journeys online that a lot of people thought differently, that I hadn't uncovered some universal truth that was obvious to everybody. Maybe I hadn't uncovered any truth at all. And it really fascinated me that people can look at the same basic bits of information and come to very different conclusions about it. It made me wonder, why it is that we have these divergent worldviews and how we can interpret these things in such different ways. And so I came to the UK. I came to the University of Kent over in Canterbury to study the psychology of conspiracy theories with Dr. Karen Douglas, who is sometimes on random radio shows and things. You might have seen her, Australian lady. Very talented psychologist, and after finishing my PhD with her, I came to Hampshire. Now I'm at the University of Winchester, where I yell at students and sometimes come to yell at people in pubs. It's a nice change. I've been publishing a wide variety of stuff. Mostly recently it's been about conspiracy theories, because this is really my central research interest. It's something that I'm quite passionate about, and it's something that I've sort of focused my research efforts on, because I think it's something that most people would agree is relevant, whether you're on one side or another. If you think that all conspiracy theories are crap, or if you think that conspiracy theories are basically the correct way to think about things, and everything else that we're told by the government and by the media is crap. I think there's a general consensus that there's some importance here, that we need to bridge this gap, and we need to understand why people have such different opinions about these things, why some people take them very seriously and others don't take them seriously at all. And this is a very old story in a lot of ways. You look at the history of conspiracy theories, and some people will say that they're a very recent invention. That conspiracy theories, as we know them, didn't exist at all until the sort of late 19th, early 20th century. Some people say it was the French Revolution. But the story that I like, true or otherwise, is that it really goes back a long way. And the first conspiracy theories are about witches. And that witches get together in these witches' sabbaths, and they cavort and conspire, and there's the devil himself, Old Scratch, at the top of the pyramid, directing everything along. And in many ways, I think this is true, because conspiracy theories are sometimes used as a way of scapegoating. Something negative happens, and it's attributed to a certain person or group of people. And this is certainly how witch panics happen, and how witch trials and theories about witches' sabbaths played out. Crops failed, or some child was stillborn or something like that, and it was attributed to some sort of malign influence of witches, creating rain or summoning little creepy green demons tends to come along and do various mischief. So I think that conspiracy theories have a pretty long history, and they might have diversified a lot since the days of the witches' Sabbaths. We certainly have more things to worry about now. I think that in a lot of ways you can see the evolution of conspiracy theories over time, and the way that we are suspicious of other people, and the way that we're suspicious that things are being hidden from us, that we're not being told the truth. And of course, there's any number of conspiracy theories that are about now. I'm sure I don't have to name them all to you, but they range everywhere from the New World Order to your classic Jewish world conspiracy, moon hoax, and the gay agenda targeting the family in the crosshairs. It's a bit dim here, you can't really see it, but it's this old school YouTube video with marriage being targeted with a gay sniper rifle. So inevitably, the question comes up of what is and is not a conspiracy theory, because not everybody can agree on what is or is not a conspiracy theory. And a lot of the time, conspiracy theory gets used as a synonym for bullshit. And the idea is that if something is not a conspiracy theory, or if something is a conspiracy theory, it can't be true and we don't have to pay attention to it. I'm not sure that this is fully true. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I just want to do a quick show of hands here. So, you're part of a jury. The prosecutor comes up and tells you, these four men are part of a criminal gang, and they're getting together and planning to rob a bank. So who thinks that that is a conspiracy theory? Who would call that a conspiracy theory? Okay, so a couple of people. Now, this is a theory about a conspiracy, right? It's a criminal conspiracy. They're conspiring together to commit a criminal act. It's something bad. They're plotting to do it. It was kept secret, presumably for some amount of time before the prosecutor found out about it. So what is it about this that makes it not a conspiracy theory? I'm genuinely asking, does anybody, can anyone justify why this isn't a conspiracy theory? You don't know if they've done it? So, yeah, so there's some uncertainty, maybe there's evidence. So the evidence might be something that differentiates a conspiracy theory from not a conspiracy theory. Well, here's another one. One of the Malaysia Airlines flights from a couple of years back was abducted by aliens. UFO came along and snatched it up. MH370, that's why they haven't found it, searching around in the seas around Australia. Who would call this a conspiracy theory? Now, I would argue that that's not a conspiracy theory. There's no conspiracy. To conspire means to plan something in secret. Now, there's not necessarily a secret plot happening here. You know, maybe on the alien ship, the captain said, you know, beam them up, Zorblacks, and Zorblacks beamed up the plane. But we don't know this, and that's not explicitly part of the theory. We have this idea, this intuitive idea that this is a conspiracy theory. Maybe there's an idea that it's being covered up and the authorities know about it, they're not telling us. Maybe that would be a conspiracy. But just the fact of an alien abduction doesn't necessarily equal conspiracy, even though it's this weird thing that's kind of out there. But that seems to be the sort of the schema for conspiracy theory, even if this doesn't fit a sort of consistent definition that we can really articulate. Your friends get together to plan you a surprise party, and you suspect that they're doing this. Are you now a conspiracy theorist? Who thinks you're a conspiracy theorist? Yeah? Okay, so a few people are coming around to my way of thinking. So, I would argue that in many ways this is not a conspiracy theory, because conspiracy theory usually has a connotation that something evil is going on, that something nasty is being planned. You don't really hear much about positive conspiracy theories, and I've only heard examples of like one or two. And you know, for instance, in India they have this conspiracy theory about the 9 unknown men, who are these ancient sort of wise sages who dispense wisdom throughout the ages. And you know, they've lived forever, and all the major advances in technology are these 9 guys slowly doling out knowledge. Which is interesting, it is kind of positive that there are these people looking out for us. But that's pretty uncommon. Most conspiracy theories have this evil element to them, you know, spiriting planes away or robbing a bank or something. All right, what about this one? The government sexed up the case for the war in Iraq, and the media hopped on board, and the country went to war under false pretenses. Who thinks this is a conspiracy theory? Okay. Yeah, this one is another place where it's contested, because it's generally fairly broadly accepted, I think by a majority of people, that that's a true thing. And then the question is, well, is a conspiracy theory true? If it's true, is it no longer a conspiracy theory? And you see people use this as like a rhetorical device. They say things like, well, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's true, but that kind of implies that there's no overlap, and I'm not sure if that's completely true either. So I think that there's an interesting complexity to the definition here. This is what I use in my research, because eventually I have to make my mind up or I'm going to go crazy and I won't get any work done, or less than I do now anyway. So I think that this is a good way to define it. It's a proposed secret plot by a group of relatively powerful people or organizations to accomplish a sinister goal through deception of the public. And there are 4 elements there. Secrecy, so you can't conspire openly. There has to be some element of secrecy there. Power, the group that's doing it has to be somewhat powerful, otherwise they wouldn't have any hope of accomplishing whatever aims they're trying to accomplish. There has to be some malevolent aspect to it. There has to be the sense that somebody's trying to get away with something. That if it was more openly known, people would object. And that's obviously a subjective judgment, what's malevolent. People might have different opinions, but I think it's usually from the perspective of whoever's talking about it. And deception. And I think that's very important, because there's always this element of a cover story to a conspiracy theory, that what we think is real actually isn't. And so we can't trust what seems to be the case, because there's actually this hidden layer of reality that's underneath that. And importantly, under this definition, they could be true or false. I don't like to discriminate, because a lot of the time these are about things that we can't really know about, or because of the way that they work, epistemically, the way that they're defined. It's hard to find evidence directly for or against them. And so this is the definition that I use in my research. Sorry, just looking at the time here, I'm not texting. So, a question that I first set out to answer is, why do people believe conspiracy theories? And that's also the question that I get when people usually ask me about my research. They say, why do people believe conspiracy theories? And this kind of reveals a certain bias, that if you're approaching a question from a certain angle. Why is it that we're not asking, why doesn't everybody believe that 9/11 was an inside job? What is wrong with those people? They're crazy. Why do people buy the government's lies? These are questions that you could ask if you're coming at it from the other perspective. And functionally, this might not make too much of a difference in terms of the research that we do, because the research can usually answer both questions. So if we find that, for instance, something is correlated with beliefs in conspiracy theories, we can say, okay, well, this also kind of answers the question of why some people reject conspiracy theories, and they don't take them seriously. These can equally answer the question. So I'm just heading off any questions about this, because it is a pretty common one, and it's a fair one. We do have to acknowledge our biases in this kind of research. So psychologists and other social scientists, I'm going to focus mostly on psychologists here, but I'm going to claim Adorno, because Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism, how could I not? We thought about conspiracy theories in various ways through the ages. As with a lot of social psychology, it really picked up after the Second World War. That's when it started to be studied in a sort of hopefully rigorous academic sense. Adorno, Theodor Adorno, who was a social scientist in the 40s and 50s, part of the Frankfurt School, thought that conspiracy thinking was kind of an element of fascism or authoritarianism. So basically Adorno was greatly concerned with how the Nazis came to power in Germany. He thought that a big ingredient of this was conspiracy thinking. And specifically, he thought that it was a projection, so using very Freudian sort of terms, a projection of the person's own aggressive impulses onto the world around them. So it's someone who's a very aggressive person, they're sneaky and they like to plot, and they project these impulses onto the world around them. And so they, being sneaky and aggressive themselves, see sneakiness and aggression in the people around them, and particularly among minority groups. Conspiracy thinking in about the 50s was quite synonymous with anti-Semitism, specifically anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, because there was such a focus on the war and on Nazi Germany and on the mindset of the fascist or the authoritarian. And so that was one of the early influences on the psychology of conspiracy theories. But this was in really the infancy of social psychology. This was when we were still very Freudian. We talked about things like projection, which doesn't happen so much these days. The other big influence from around this time period in the 60s really was Hofstadter, Richard Hofstadter, not Douglas Hofstadter from Gödel Escher Bach. Important difference. This is something that you might have seen being quoted around the last American election, or indeed around Brexit, people talking about the paranoid style. And this was Hofstadter's idea that if somebody thinks that conspiracies run the world, then they have the paranoid style of politics. And he went to pains to say that, I'm not saying these people are crazy, but, and after that but was a lot of explanations of how people who believe conspiracy theories are basically paranoid in a sort of subclinical sense. And that, sort of these ideas of persecution that you see in psychotic I guess an isomorphism there. Now, he didn't say that this was a sign of mental illness. He just said it was a thought process, and that it was sort of a way of doing politics that was reminiscent of these mental illnesses. And this, of course, was very influential as well, just in the way that people talk about conspiracy theories, not just the way that academics do that. From the 60s onward, though, we started to progress into things that you would recognize more as contemporary psychology. We had quantitative studies, people doing surveys and survey research, questionnaires, experiments. And the personality psychologists really took over at this time. And they started looking at things like, what is it that separates conspiracy theorists, if there is such a thing, from anyone else? And so they looked at things like, what are the associations with people who are very skeptical of the official account of the JFK assassination, for instance, or Martin Luther King, or Watergate even. Watergate was a subject of a lot of these studies, which is great because a lot of people wouldn't consider Watergate a conspiracy theory. And so there were these questions that were asked, and there were a few correlates that were found. People who believe more conspiracy theories tend to have more of an external locus of control. And this just means that you think that you're not in control of your life, that you're kind of at the mercy of outside forces, which makes sense that if you have this as a sort of mental orientation, you might take conspiracy theories of control by others more seriously. People who believe more conspiracy theories tend to be less trustful of other people, not just governments and corporations and such, but also neighbors and coworkers and whatnot. Tend to be less agreeable. It's one of the big 5 personality factors, agreeableness. And having a greater sense of anomie or alienation from society. People who are into more conspiracy theories tend to be more outside the mainstream, to feel like their values and ideals are not really reflected in how society works. They feel a bit like outsiders. Since the 2000s, there's been a big explosion of research, and most of it has been in the social cognitive tradition. And I count myself among this tradition as well. And this is a subfield of psychology that kind of looks at the interplay between individual thought and social interaction. So how do we act differently when we're dealing with other people, and does it depend on what sort of person we're dealing with and how we think about them? And this is when experimental methods start to come in quite heavily. We would do experiments where we would get people to read different accounts of an event and then ask, what's your perception of this? Do you think it was a conspiracy? That kind of thing. And so this was really concerned with situational influences or social influences on conspiracy belief. So a big one is feeling that, like a feeling of lacking control or a feeling of uncertainty. If you feel like you're not in control of what's happening to you, then conspiracy theories seem more likely in that moment. Or if you're uncertain about something, conspiracy theories also seem more likely. There are social group dynamics at work. You're more likely to think that another social group that you don't like is conspiring. So if you have a negative opinion of members of a certain political party, you might think that it's more likely that they're conspiring among themselves than a political party that you do like, for instance. Moral judgments is another one. If you think that the people in power are essentially immoral, then you're likely to think they're conspiring. No surprise there. Relative power, if it's a powerful group, then it's more likely that they're conspiring. And broader beliefs and worldviews play into it as well. So this is not only ideology, but also the idea of conspiracy theories themselves. If you believe a lot of conspiracy theories, then you're quite likely to believe new conspiracy theories as they come along, because that's sort of a worldview that you have. That if you think conspiracy is the governing force in world history, then if something new happens, that might be the way that you explain it. Similarly, if you don't believe that conspiracy theories are a thing and something happens that perhaps might be a conspiracy theory, you're likely to reject that because you don't find conspiracies likely. And there are some pretty striking demonstrations of these. I'm going to show you one now. I want you all to write a 200-word essay. We'll brought pen and paper, right? So, tell me about a time in your life when you didn't have control over what was going on. You had to just go along with whatever happened. It doesn't have to be a good experience or a bad one, could be anything. Just write out 200 words on that. And go. Okay. All right, all done? Good. So, now that you've done this, this is the manipulation that we would use for inducing a feeling of lacking control. You get somebody to write about this or describe an experience, it sort of brings them back and puts them in the mood of not having control over what's happening. And you can do the opposite. You can say write about a time when you were in control fully, or you can just say write about your trip to the amusement park or whatever as the control condition. And there have been a few variations on this, but the big study is Wits and England in 2008. So after you do this manipulation, you show people these pictures. There's a bunch of these. This is just 2 of them. Some of the following images have pictures of people, animals, or objects hidden in them. Do you see a hidden picture in these images? And if so, what is it?
A bear on the left.
A bear on the left? Okay. Any other guesses? Faces? All right. Okay. Anyone else?
Seems the man in black, JFK. Freemasons.
Spoiler, there are probably no Freemasons in here. Any other guesses?
Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland, on which one? Both?
Yes.
Okay. She's gone through the looking glass here, and that's she's put. No, okay, so I think this loses something on a big projector screen. There's a camera in the left one. You can see the sort of boxy body here, and then there's the lens. Yep. And on the right, there's nothing. The right is just noise. It's random dots. So these are degraded images, basically. Some of them have something in them, and some of them don't. You would get people to once they've done this essay thing, they go through these pictures and they write what they see if they see anything. And inducing a loss of control produces a whole variety of interesting effects. If you lose control, or if you feel like you've lost control, you see more of those images in the snowy pictures task, in that distorted image task. Even when there's nothing, you're more likely to see patterns in noise. You're more likely to endorse superstitious explanations for things, so you're more likely to engage in superstitious behavior, or to say that superstitions are probably true. You should knock on wood if you say something bad might happen. And you're more likely to agree with conspiracy theories. They would present people with conspiratorial explanations for various social things. It was fairly mundane stuff, like getting passed over for a promotion at work. You think your coworker conspired with your boss to make you lose the promotion. That kind of thing. And there were several other knock-on effects of this as well. It's a very interesting little paper. There have been a few replication attempts, and they've all gone pretty well. Some of you probably might know about the replication problem in psychology, but this one seems pretty solid. And so it seems like there's some sort of signal detection thing here, or pattern seeking, that when you're induced to feel a lack of control, you start grasping for straws a bit. You start looking for patterns and finding a way to make sense of it, or to maybe get back control, because you're not in control right now. It's a way of taking control back. And the interesting thing is that these effects are washed out by affirmations. And affirmations, I don't mean in the crunchy, fluffy New Age case of like, I'm a good person, people like me. It's more like affirming your values, things that you value. So, I really think that the quest for knowledge is our highest calling, or something like that. And poof, control manipulation effects are. It's very interesting. And the thought is that sort of affirms your values and gives you a sense of control back, because you sort of replaced yourself in the world. And this goes to a very interesting idea about control and why control is important, feeling control. And a feeling of lacking control is the focus of a whole separate theoretical area in psychology, which is called compensatory control. It's the idea that when we lose the feeling of control over something, we grasp to get it back. We try to do things that restore that sense of control to us. And that can be seeing patterns where there are none, or it can be doing superstitious things to try to influence what's going on in the world, or it could be suspicion toward other people, so that we can maybe find some social pattern that we haven't noticed before. The idea is that a feeling of lacking control is essentially a threatening thing. We don't like to feel like we're out of control. And so we have this uncertainty and fear about our place in the world. If you affirm your values, your transcendent values, you restore control. You restore that sense of control because now you're framing the world in terms that you can come to grips with. And all of these other things do the same thing. And the idea that comes out of this is that conspiracy theories in some way are uncertainty management, that how seriously you take conspiracy theory depends on how uncertain you are about the world, and they can restore a sense of uncertainty that you have. So if you're in an uncertain situation, or a situation where you don't have control over things, conspiracy theories might seem fairly likely. If you're in a situation where you feel like you're in control, even if that feeling of control is an illusion, then you're less likely to take conspiracy theories seriously. And I have an interesting case study here. This is something that I've been very interested in for a long time. I don't fancy my chances of publishing this because this is something that not many people have heard of. Predictive programming. Has anyone heard about predictive programming before? One person. Oh my God, that is a record. I've done it. This is the third time I've done this talk now. This is the first time anybody has said they've heard of it, so thank you. Predictive programming is appearances of events or names or themes in mass media that seem to align with future events, whether those future events are actual things that happen or just predictions about things that might happen or that seem likely to happen. And there are many examples of this. I have a wonderful YouTube link here that will have to go unused because we don't have Wi-Fi here. But I'll describe to you what happens. It's a scene from the short-lived X-Files spin-off, The Lone Gunman. Did anybody watch this? Okay, a few X-Files superfans in the audience. Basically, the X-Files had these three sort of peripheral characters who show up every few episodes, who were these sort of stereotypical kooky crackpot conspiracy theorists who ran this like National Enquirer, Weekly World News type sort of conspiracy rag, I guess. And they would just publish these stories, and eventually they bump into Mulder and Scully every now and then and help them out. And they got a spin-off series. It lasted for a season. It wasn't very good. But the first episode, the pilot, had an interesting sort of plot device. What happened was that they were on the trail of this conspiracy to start a war in the Middle East. And then the way the conspiracy decided to do this was by hijacking some passenger jets and crashing them into the World Trade Center. And this was aired in 2000. So this made quite a splash in 2001 when 9/11 happened. The few people, including myself, who saw The Lone Gunman thought back and went, oh, that's weird. And as a bonus, they even did it remotely. Like the planes were hijacked by this remote software, and there's this very tense scene where they're hacking and hack faster. I'm hacking as fast as we can. Yeah, and then bleep bloop and text comes out and they save it at the last minute, pull up, and they don't hit the towers, and then the conspiracy goes, oh, curses the Lone Gunman. It's not the best show, but people look back on this now and they say, why is it that this happened? Did they know? Like, what are the chances that somebody would guess something like that? Crashing planes through the World Trade Center isn't something you do every day. And this is just one example. There are lots more. The Simpsons is famous for this. So here's the episode where they go to New York, where Homer's car gets impounded, and it's at the foot of the World Trade Center. And here's sort of a guidebook for New York, and you can tour it for $9. And then the two World Trade Center towers next to it spells 9/11. Yeah, right? Spooky. So, and then here's the Dark Knight, the scene where they're looking over the map, they're plotting how to take the city back from the thugs who have taken it over. And here's Sandy Hook. The phrase Sandy Hook is spelled out on this map. Commissioner Gordon is pointing to something, and you can see this in the corner of the shot. And this took place before the Sandy Hook school shooting. It's strange. What's that doing there? And of course, the Hunger Games is a massive thing for this. I don't know about the writing process behind the Hunger Games, but it is this sort of dystopian series about a future with this oppressive government that divides the people into zones, and it has these gladiatorial games, and it's all very oppressive and totalitarian, and there's this sort of media landscape. And it's like I don't know why I'm describing the Hunger Games to you. Probably a lot of you have seen it. But for those of you who haven't, imagine The Running Man with a higher budget and more archery. And a lot of people look at this and say, well, obviously this is predictive programming, because people who are into sort of Agenda 21, New World Order type conspiracy theories, they look at this and they see a lot of the same themes happening. They say, well, look, this is confirmation that they're planning to do this stuff, because they're planting these ideas in the media. And these ideas are out there, and they're going to affect people psychologically. They're going to do these things to people. You know, it's going to affect how they think about the future. And this is one of those prospective instances of predictive programming. So this is predictive programming, the idea that things that are going to happen in the future are predicted in media beforehand, and this is a way of sort of mind control. It's a conspiracy to psychologically program the population to prepare them for coming events, that people will be in some way prepared by you know, watching the Hunger Games or seeing 9/11 in the Simpsons or whatever. And so this is a psychological claim that this is going to program the world's population, that it's going to have some sort of psychological effect, having these familiar things in the media. It's going to somehow do something. It's honestly a little bit vague. But it is a psychological claim. It's not really based on psychology. The attempts to sort of give a more detailed background usually hinge on some things that are, I guess you'd call them like understandings of psychology that are a bit out of date, or you know, less than, they don't comport fully with the research that we know about, which I'll get into in a bit. But the upshot of this is that we can use this to predict the future. You know, we can look at the Hunger Games and say, well, this is what they're putting in movies, now we know what they're going to do next. So we can divine the conspirators' future plans by looking at the media. And Alex Jones is big into this. David Icke is also a big fan of predictive programming. He has called the Hunger Games, you know, 100% predictive programming. And so the question becomes, you know, what's the point of all this? It's programming us. Well, what is it programming us to do? How is it programming us? How is this stuff supposed to affect us? Like, why? Obviously, this is risky. If you go up to Christopher Nolan and say, could you put the word Sandy Hook in the corner of one of your maps? Just asking. Or you hold a gun to his head and tell him to do it. This is a risky thing. You know, it's not trivial to do that. So what's the benefit? There has to be some reason why this is supposedly happening. And there are a couple of reasons. One is that is what I call the dismissal as fiction hypothesis. These are terms that I've made up. Nobody really has broken it down like this that I'm aware of. And this is the idea that if you depict these future events in fiction, you know, you have a totalitarian future with a totalitarian government. People will watch this and they'll say, no, that's a fun story. That's a fun story. And then when these things start happening in real life, they'll say, no, that sort of thing doesn't happen in real life. This is only in movies. So people are going to be off their guard when they bring in the actual Hunger Games, or when they do the actual IngSoc or whatever. And so this is one hypothesis about what predictive programming is supposed to do. It puts people off their guard, and it makes them think that this sort of thing is strictly fictional and they don't have to worry about it. There's the inevitability or acquiescence hypothesis, which is another one that comes up, as you'll see. These are all very sort of informal discussions in these things, a lot of YouTube videos and whatnot. And this is the idea that if you depict these future events in media, like a science fiction film or something like that, then it's kind of the opposite of the other one. It's like they're inevitable. Like if you see, Gattaca is an example that often gets brought up. You know, it's a great movie with Ethan Hawke about sort of genetic discrimination in the future. That if you're not genetically engineered, you can't get a job, and you're discriminated against. And the idea is that, well, this is the future. This is what's going to happen. It's inevitable. There's no way that this won't happen, and so we just have to come to terms with it because this is the way that things are going. So when these things finally do come along and the oppressive totalitarian government brings in the Hunger Games future, then people will say, well, we always kind of knew this was coming, so might as well make the most of it. And so this is sort of the opposite. It's the opposite idea that you're kind of boiling the frog slowly, but you're also showing the frog a picture of a cooked frog, and the frog kind of goes in. It's a tortured metaphor. Then there's what I call the controlled opposition hypothesis. And this is based on the fact that these dystopian types of films and these sorts of media productions usually have one protagonist who's sort of the leader of the resistance, or they're kind of the chosen one. And usually, especially in the Hunger Games, they become sort of a figurehead of this resistance movement. So we have Katniss here, the hero of the Hunger Games. And so she's the chosen one. She's the one that everybody has to follow, the symbolic head of the revolution. And the idea is that when the future comes around, people will inevitably try to resist. They'll look to rally behind a figure, a central figurehead person, because that's what they do in the movies. So they'll look around for their own Katniss Everdeen or their own, both people from Fahrenheit 451 or whatever. And those people will be controlled by the conspiracy. The resistance leaders are going to be co-opted ahead of time, and they'll present this person as sort of the chosen one to lead the resistance, but they're actually working for the conspirators. And so this is the idea, the controlled opposition hypothesis. And so I was interested in predictive programming because it's a very psychological theory. All of these hypotheses are in principle testable. We can test these theories. It makes these falsifiable predictions about the world, at least in some of the variations. It does. We can test if somebody is predictively programmed by watching a lot of these sorts of dystopian movies. Does that change how they're going to act in certain situations? And there are a few, I'm not saying that all conspiracy theories are unfalsifiable. That's a claim that gets leveled a lot. I don't think it's quite true. I think that there are plenty of them about, flat Earth. You could go up in a spaceship, see if the Earth is flat, simple enough. You can go up and sample chemtrails, see what you find. Same sort of deal. And predictive programming, I think, fits into that class of things that are possible to falsify. So I did a study on this. I actually did two, but I only have time to present one. I think. Yeah. So, like any good psychologist, I started with the best sample possible, 226 psychology students, 187 of whom for women. Got to get that good gender balance in there. Just to talk about sampling for a second, obviously this is not ideal. It's not a general population sample. In psychology, we try to get as good of a sample as we can, and often we can't do much better than this. For this kind of deal, though, I don't think it's a bad thing, because predictive programming is usually about popular media. And a lot of it is about stuff like the Hunger Games, or it's about the Simpsons, and it's things that are targeted at relatively young people who have some spending money, and who are going to have young, impressionable minds, and they can go out and go to the films and buy the merchandise and so on. And so, since this was kind of largely the target audience for a lot of this stuff, I didn't feel too bad about having a student sample in this case. So I got all these students, and I gave them a questionnaire. And it was basically a checklist of 100 films that had these sort of supposed predictive programming elements in them. So this was mostly dystopian films of some sort. So Gattaca was in there, the Hunger Games films were in there, the ones that were out at the time. This was a couple years ago now. Zardoz was in there, if you've seen Zardoz. Zardoz was part of that checklist. It was hard to get to 100, but I did the best I could. And these were things that were either flagged up, on the internet as look at the predictive programming in this movie, or, just based on the fact that it's set in a dystopian oppressive future with a dystopian oppressive government. And I just had them check off which of them they've seen. Then I gave them this questionnaire about reactions to a hypothetical future totalitarian government. So, if a totalitarian government happens, what would you do to try to counteract it? And basically, the different hypotheses about predictive programming will say that people will react in different ways. So we'll see different patterns in the data according to these different hypotheses. So if they are exposed to more of these films, presumably they're programmed harder than those who have seen fewer of them, or those who haven't seen any of them. And so, we should see more strength of a certain effect in the data than we do for these people who haven't seen any of these films. So here's the scenario I used. Imagine that 5 years from now, a movement begins to take shape that would transform the present system of government into a much more centralized institution with broader legislative powers. The proposed new government would agree with many of your positions on a variety of social and economic issues, but would heavily increase CCTV and internet surveillance, restrict the expression of opposing political opinions in television, newspapers, and other media, and institute an increased presence of military police on streets in order to help prevent crime and terrorism. So I didn't want this to be obviously super evil. I tried to make it kind of dictatorship-like, where people might agree with some of these things, and they might say, okay, well, that bit about surveillance doesn't sound great, but I'm willing to put up with it if we get whatever else I would want this to be. So, and it worked. I got a pretty good range of responses. Just did some straight-up correlations, non-parametric Spearman correlations, if you're a statsy person, between these two measures. So how would people resist the totalitarian government in various ways? I asked them, how likely would you be to join a protest march, or give out leaflets, talk to your friends and neighbors about voting against the new government? and all the way up to, you know, violence against opposing politicians and smashing windows, property destruction, and joining an underground resistance movement, leading an underground resistance movement. These were all things that I asked about. And so the first hypothesis that I looked at was acquiescence. The acquiescence hypothesis is that if you see more of these sort of programmed films, the more likely you are to just sort of, you know, lie down and not resist when this stuff happens. And so I tested that, found that no form of resistance correlates negatively with the number of films that somebody sees. So if they see more films, they're not saying that they'd be any less likely to resist. Mostly, film exposure positively predicts resistance intention. So people who saw more of these films are more likely, or say they'd be more likely to resist. You know, they circle higher numbers on the scale. And there was no correlation between exposure to these films and support for this sort of future totalitarian government. It was a non-significant correlation. So it doesn't seem like the acquiescence hypothesis holds much water, given what people are reporting about. They don't seem any more positive about this totalitarian government, and they're no more likely to lie down and just let it have its way. The dismissal as fiction hypothesis was up next. If the idea is that plot elements in these films seem unrealistic because they're fictional, and they're unlikely to happen, people who've seen more of these films should find this type of government less likely to happen. This was another question I asked. How likely do you think that this would happen? And there was no correlation there either. So it doesn't seem like this is being dismissed as fiction by the people who've seen more of these things. That doesn't seem to be the case at all. So no correlation there. And then there's the controlled opposition hypothesis, and this is the interesting one. So there was one item that was leading or founding an organization that opposes the new totalitarian government. How likely is it that you would do that? And the controlled opposition hypothesis says that no, people wouldn't do that. They'd join the resistance movement of the chosen one instead. And there was no correlation here. So it goes against that idea that it works by crushing the desire to resist independently and herd everybody into these sort of central resistance movements. The one thing that agreed with any predictive programming hypothesis was this idea that people are going to be more likely, if they've seen more of these films, to join an organization led by somebody else that opposes this new government. And we saw a small positive correlation there. So this agrees with half of this prediction, that people are going to be more likely to join these resistance movements. But this really just reflects a general increase in all resistance behaviors for people who've seen more of these films. And surely you would think that it would benefit the conspirators more if nobody joined any resistance movement or resisted at all. That would seem like a better idea. So overall, we didn't find a lot of support for this idea of predictive programming in any of its forms. People who heavily consume this type of media don't take totalitarianism any less seriously than people who watch less of it, and they report higher intentions to actively resist it. This is the opposite of what predictive programming says. You can watch The Matrix all you want, and it's not going to want to make you side with Agent Smith, right? This is not what happens in these films. And I've told people about this who are like colleagues of mine, and they look at me like I'm crazy, and they say, well, no, of course not. Why would you ever think that? And this is the thing. Predictive programming is a psychological theory in that it's about psychology, but it's not derived from psychology. It has this sort of veneer of psychological plausibility because you can talk about cultivating responses. Are you denying that they use propaganda? And of course, they can manipulate us with the media. And sure, that's fine, but not like this. This doesn't seem to be in any way how this works. And often, I've got into discussions with people about this, and there's a lot of hostility toward this sort of mainstream psychology, scientific or empirical psychology, the stuff you read about in journals. When there's not hostility of it, there's usually an ignorance of it, and it's kind of based on this pop psychology idea. It's what we call folk psychology. It fits with some intuitive ideas about how the brain might work or how advertising might work, but it doesn't necessarily match up with what we see empirically. But there's still this sort of this thrust towards psychology about how this is a very psychological thing. You see texts that people post about predictive programming, YouTube videos or whatever, and they all say things like this is a subliminal thing, and they're using priming, and it's neuro-linguistic programming, and so on. But generally, these don't really match the way that the terms are used themselves. And you see the Hunger Games, the fact that it's a dystopian government isn't subliminal. It's supraliminal. It's supraliminal, in fact. And generally, I mean, these theories are quite flexible and quite vague. I don't think that there's a definitive text. You know, if you ask 5 different people about predictive programming, you'll get 5 different opinions of what it's supposed to be and which versions of it are disinfo without throw us off the real trail. And there's another hypothesis that I haven't gone into yet about predictive programming, because it kind of goes out of the realm of psychology. And it gets back to what I talked about at the very beginning with the witches' Sabbaths. The idea is that this is a kind of magic that's happening. This is what they call the revelation of the method hypothesis, or the thoughts create reality hypothesis. And this is the idea that it's not really psychological, you know, maybe it does something psychological, but the real point of it is that it's a sort of occult ritual. That the conspirators, they can't just do something, they have to sort of declare their intention to do it. Like if you're playing pool and you're sinking the 8 ball, and you have to say which corner pocket it's going to go into, otherwise it doesn't count. And the idea that is that they have to engage in some sort of ritual to declare what they're doing before they have to do it, and that's why we have this predictive programming stuff happening. Or there's the idea that's sort of based on the law of attraction, you know, like The Secret, that if you think about something, it'll happen more. And the idea is that this is you know, making people think about these dystopian futures, and if people think about them, then that'll bring them about because of, you know, it'll attract these things to us, these dystopias. And in fact, this is not something that everybody says about predictive programming. Like I said, there's a lot of diversity of opinion, but most of them acknowledge that there's something occultic about the whole affair, the whole idea of predictive programming, because there's all this ritual and symbolism and all these hidden meanings, and you can sort of delve into these texts like you're dissecting a sheep liver, you know, cut into an episode of The Simpsons and you read the entrails as they spill it out. And it is a process of divination in a lot of ways, because you can look at these media products and you can see the future that way. And I think this goes back to you know, what I said earlier about compensatory control and about managing uncertainty. It's a way of regaining a sort of certainty about what the future is going to be like, and a guarantee that we can not only know what it's going to be about, and how the future will play out, but also how we can affect it. And that's all I got.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take a little bit of a break now, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and do questions.